Well, hello. I haven't done a video on here for rather a long time, and I thought I ought to do one. So, as summer finally seems to have arrived, I thought I'd do one outdoors. It's a bit difficult because the sun's shining in my eyes, but as you can see, I'm in this verdant meadow surrounded by beautiful wild flowers, and I thought I'd do a video about a piece called Song of Summer. It seems very appropriate as summer finally seems to have arrived. Now, this is a work by Delius. I've been listening to quite a lot of music of Delius recently. He's a composer I've been interested in for years, but I go through sort of phases. Sometimes I like his music and sometimes I'm not so fond of it, but I've been listening to it a lot recently. He's quite a curious and interesting figure. He's a British composer, or he was a British composer, at least he was born in Britain, but he actually spent most of his life abroad. He didn't actually like this country all that much, partly I think because he was brought up in Yorkshire, in Bradford. He was born in Bradford in the, I think it was the 1870s. I should check that really, but anyway, and his father was an industrialist and he didn't like that whole kind of sort of grimy Victorian industrial context. In fact, he got his father to give him some money and he went off to Florida, of all places, to run an orange plantation. He wasn't very successful at doing that, but he did, by this time he was wanting to become a composer, and he wrote a lovely piece called the Florida Suite later on, which was based on his experiences in Florida. And amongst other things, he uses some melodies that were sung by the black African workers on the plantation at that time. Anyway, he came back to Europe, and he spent most of his life actually living in France. And he was also very fond of Scandinavia, particularly Norway. And he was a very curious figure. He in some ways you could say his music is very, very English sounding, and yet maybe not. It has a kind of exotic side to it as well. And he died in 1934. It was the same year as Elgar and Holst died. So that was quite a grim year for British music, actually, because three major composers died in 1 year. And both his parents, by the way, were German, even though he was born in Bradford. And he related very much to German literature and culture, and particularly the works of Nietzsche, the dreaded philosopher and poet Nietzsche, who maybe rather unfairly has been blamed for an association with the Nazis. And the sun is actually going behind a cloud now, which is a pity because it's spoiling the view of the flowers, but never mind. He was influenced by Nietzsche, and particularly by the Nietzschean sort of philosophy that basically Nietzsche rejected religion and Christianity. He called Christianity the religion of slaves, and he developed this philosophy that was later warped by the Nazis of what he called the higher man. That is, that he felt that individual human beings should develop their own sense of meaning of the world. They should create the meaning of the world for themselves through their own willpower, rather than depending on religion and God and so on. And basically it was a hedonistic philosophy, at least in Delius's version. The idea was to enjoy life, enjoy the world, because you didn't have very long here, and so you better enjoy it while you could. And this runs through all his music. His music has this incredible quality of beauty, and a kind of a lot of it's based on themes from nature, like a Song of Summer, and it expresses this sort of sense of rapture, the transient but very, very intense and beautiful beauties of nature and the natural world. Now, Delius took this philosophy rather further than that. He led a very, very hedonistic life in Paris in the early part of the 20th century, and he got himself involved in all kinds of things, hedonistic goings on with poets and artists as well as musicians. And he led a rather wild bohemian life, as was the fashion in those days. The result was actually very tragic because he contracted syphilis, and as shown very, very famously in a marvellous film by Ken Russell, which is also called The Song of Summer, which I'd very much recommend. he ended up in the last part of his life. He was blind and paralysed. So this musician and artist who preached the doctrine of enjoying life to the full, in the end was reduced to almost a physical wreck, who couldn't really do anything for himself. But even then, he never surrendered. He never gave in, and he never apologised for the way he led his life. And he just went on to the bitter end. And there was a very extraordinary and rather moving passage in the late part of his life, which is what the Ken Russell film is largely about, where a young man called Eric Fenby from Yorkshire came over to France, to Grès-sur-Loing, the village where Delius lived with his wife, and helped him to compose some of his last works. He couldn't actually compose because he couldn't hold a pen, he couldn't write, and he couldn't see. He could hear all right. So Fenby actually wrote a lot of music down by dictation, which was a very, very torturous and difficult process. But by trial and error, and Delius was an absolutely impossible, unbearable man. I mean, he was in a lot of pain and he was suffering, but he'd always been a pretty sort of impossible person. He didn't spare anyone to achieve what he wanted to achieve, and he was very, very nasty to Fenby to start with, anyway. But then eventually they did work out this modus vivendi, and rather wonderfully, Delius was able to write several late works through the medium of Fenby. Anyway, perhaps his greatest work is a work called The Mass of Life, which is a setting of texts by Nietzsche from Thus Spake Zarathustra, one of Nietzsche's books. It's a very strange work, but it has the most incredible, glorious music in it, and it has several passages which are typical of what I mentioned earlier, of this celebration of the rapture, the intensity, the bliss of the beauty of life and existence while it lasts. And Delius, perhaps more than any other composer I can think of, somehow captures that quality. And there's a particularly wonderful movement in the middle of the Mass of Life, which is at midday, and it celebrates the glory of midsummer and midday, and the sun and the meadows, and Zarathustra is almost asleep. And I think in a way the text that's set there expresses the philosophy of this piece, A Song of Summer. A Song of Summer itself, it doesn't have any words, it's just an orchestral piece which evokes this rapture, this bliss of the beauty of nature in the midst of summer. But allowing for the rather inflated translation of the German, this bit from the Mass of Life kind of sums it up. It goes like this: glowing midday sleeps on the meadows, thou liest in the heather, like a delicate breeze that no eye sees, as our ocean becalmed it dances lightly, feather-like, thus danceth sleep on me. This is the coveted hour of solemn silence, when no shepherd sounds his reed. Sweet solitude of purpling heather, O bliss. And then Zarathustra says, what befell me, hark, was it time hence that fled? Am I not falling? Fell I not? Hark, 'neath the fountain of endless day, O now break, heart, hast known life's rapture. Hush, wouldst thou now sing, O my fond spirit. Stay thy song, hush, whisper not in a word, the world is waxed perfect. Hush, now aged midday sleeps. And I think those words to some extent capture the quality of this beautiful short piece by Frederick Delius, A Song of Summer. And also, if you enjoy this piece, I would strongly recommend you look online, and you're very likely to find Ken Russell's beautiful film, A Song of Summer, which tells the story of the life of Delius. Just as a footnote, by the way, I should have mentioned that Frederick Delius was actually born in 1862. I got the date slightly wrong. And also, this piece, A Song of Summer, was composed in 1931. And it's one of the pieces, in fact, that Delius wrote after he had become blind, and with the help of Eric Fenby. So it is even more poignant in that respect, because it's a vision of the ecstatic experience of nature by a man who's actually paralysed and blind. And before I go, I just happen to be here in a rather nice spot by the river near Oxford. I thought I'd give you a little twirl so you can see that very nature that we're celebrating in this lovely piece. So here we are, fields, and there's my boat in the background. I'm moored in a little creek near Abingdon, south of Oxford. And frankly, this is the sort of place I like to be, not in horrible noisy towns and cities, and just generally trying to stay calm and be creative. So there you are, that's my introduction to A Song of Summer by Delius.